I'm Ed Tunheim. I'm a retired forester. My career was being a consulting forester and helping other people grow trees. My background is I'm from a farm family. My father immigrated from Norway and settled in South Dakota, and my mother was a daughter of other immigrants from South Dakota from Norway, and they came to California after they were married, and I was born in Vallejo, and at that time I lived in Vallejo right on through until I finished up high school. It was a close family. My father died just right after my 5th birthday and made things a little difficult during the war, but in Vallejo during the war things were happening and there was work and there was family, and we made it through and worked out just fine. So I grew up in Vallejo. My mother remarried when I was about 12, finished up school there. I found that I was living in a Navy town, and I knew I didn't want to work on the shipyard, building ships. So I looked around and I found out by the time I was about a junior in high school, I found that I'm going to have to get a whole bunch of classes in, because if I don't get a college degree, I'm going to end up having a hard time getting a job. So my stepfather had worked in logging in Idaho as a young man, and that had some influence. And so I buckled down, got into college, did my first 2 years of pre-forestry at San Jose State, got into the swing of college, being away from home, living in the college, working, and making it through. At that time, the forestry school at UC in Berkeley encouraged people to get their first couple of years someplace else. And that was a good thing, because I was not ready for Berkeley coming out of high school. The initiation into Berkeley really happened with going to summer camp the summer before my junior year. The previous 2 years I'd spent working in the summers in a state park up in Dunsmuir. And that gave me an inkling of living in the woods and working in the woods and dealing with that type of location, and I really enjoyed it. Going to summer camp put a whole new light on things, and got in the swing of going to Berkeley, and there was a lot of camaraderie. It was an independent school almost to itself, sitting on the Berkeley campus with a relatively large population of students. We must have had probably 60 forestry students and lower divisions. So it worked out fine. I finally got there, and I found that I enjoyed it. I enjoyed being out in the woods, and the combination of working in the woods and being able to make a living in the woods was really encouraging. So I was fortunate enough, I was actually hired right out of school my senior year to a small new consulting firm in Sacramento. It was Jim Greig and Harvey Striplin had just started a consulting business working with small landowners, independent landowners, and small companies. And it worked out great. We worked in the Central Sierras. We worked doing planting, thinning, pruning. I spent one summer scaling logs on a log deck. We did all kinds of odds and ends and planted a lot of trees. After about 4 years, I got married. At that time too, I was living in Santa Cruz for my first 4 years, but that was only in the winter. I spent all my summers in the Sierras in the field working, and my winters in Santa Cruz, which was a rather nice combination of things. As the work developed in Santa Cruz, we worked there more and more. A lot of small landowners were coming into the scene. In the 50s, there was a move in the forest for a lot of companies and landowners to sell their recently cut over timberland. And new people that lived in town were buying the forest land, wanted to keep it, but wanted to do something with it, but needed help. And so we fit in and worked for primarily absentee owners, small landowners, summer camps. We started working for water companies. We ended up working for 4 different water companies as their foresters on their forest land. And it worked out great. Things grew very rapidly. And after 4 years of working in the woods, I got married. And she was a recent graduate from San Jose State in commercial art. And so I was getting a lot of exposure to art. And it makes a good combination between working in the woods and looking at art. So we were able to work. I worked out of Santa Cruz from then on. When Strickland and Greig split up after 7 or 8 years, I worked with Jim Greig out of Santa Cruz then for another 20 years. We worked together and developed a management system and a procedure working with small landowners to manage their forest, to be able to enjoy it, make some money, improve the forest, and make it all work. The concept really was changing from sawmills owning forest land to individuals and water companies owning forest land that had other purposes besides growing trees and cutting them down. We ended up working for 5 different water companies, managing their forests, logging on their properties, managing it for water production primarily, but also recreation, and developing a system that we could make work for all sizes of land to fit that owner's needs. We worked for a number of summer camps where we would work on it in the wintertime, and there were kids there in the summer. We logged on summer camps, planted trees, thinned them. I spent 2 summers working with one of my clients as a forester for kids from San Francisco getting an education in the woods. We were out pruning trees, thinning trees, getting lecturers, talking about the woods. And it was interesting working with the city kids for that summer session. So we did all kinds of work. And we found it was demanding in many respects because you were dealing with things beyond the forestry aspect. You were dealing with things that meant more to the landowner than cutting down the trees and making some money. They were interested in visual aspects. They were interested in how things looked besides having trails, roads, pleasant appearance, using the property, living on the property. And so it really turned into a multiple use property. So the forests were really becoming more than the single product lumber approach. So that turned out to be really great. A couple of years ago, after I'd gone through all this stuff of working and growing trees and cutting trees and planting trees, and somebody had given me a little textbook of Gifford Pinchot's, and I looked up it, and one of his basic philosophies was never cut more trees in a year than you're growing, and that directed to volume. And boy, that hit it right on the head. And that we had actually been using that same philosophy of management as a basis for how we selected our trees in the woods. And I've had people out in the forest as we walk around, and people like to take walks in the trees and get a lecture and all that kind of stuff. And you go along, and in redwood, it's fantastic. It really works. You can take a clump of trees, because redwood keeps sprouting. Every time you cut one off, you get a whole bunch of sprouts. Well, if you have a clump of trees, the approach that we have taken is always to remove the poorest trees first. The ones that are crooked, the ones with the broken out top, the ones that are not going to do very well, all in it as long as it has a merchantable log in it. That's the first ones you take out. Plus, I have a preference for redwoods, and when my redwoods are always mixed with fir, my first choice is cut the damn fir tree down. Because I want a redwood tree growing out there. And if I'm going to plant trees, it's going to be redwood. It's not going to be fir. So we go into a clump of trees and we pick out what the poorest trees are, with the poorest form, a Douglas fir, crooked trees, one with a broken top, one that's growing nut, and to space out the clump of trees and leave your best trees to grow and thin them out. And so once you go around, like on this property, we've gone around 3 times completely and thinned our clumps out. You can look at the clump and you can see where your future is. Now, I'm looking right past the camera at a whole clump of trees, and we've thinned it 3 times, and there still is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 merchantable trees right in front of me, plus an old growth that we'll leave forever. And we've already thinned it, and we'll be back in here in maybe 3 more years, and we're going to thin it again. And I know which ones I'm going to take, because I'm looking at the poorer trees and I want to leave the best trees to grow. And so this is always a factor that we throw into it to make your improvement cuts. Never cut more volume than you're growing in a year, and always improve your stand. Don't hurt your stand or diminish the value of your stand by cutting just all the good trees and leave all the bad trees. I mean, that's pretty short term. And the long term really pays off, because for one thing, in the future, that tree's going to be worth more money than the ratty tree that's next to it. But and so that it all really paid off, because we enjoyed doing the work we were doing, and we were able to give landowners an option, a way of managing their forest that they didn't have to either ignore it or cut all the trees. And so it worked out real well. And so that's why we based our entire business on helping people out. The first few years were not easy. We planted a lot of trees and did a lot of contract work for the Forest Service. I think we had 3 years in a row when we planted a lot of trees. We planted 3 million trees in 3 years mostly under contract with the Forest Service. But then we got to, so we started doing less and less of that because we had more other forestry stuff to do. So it turned out that staying very flexible and working as a contractor, developing clientele, it worked out pretty well. As things progressed, a lot of some of our clients got together and started putting together a Forest Landowners of California. They were clients of ours that got going on it, and they were implementing the ideas that we were working on. And so it helped them get started because there were some interested people that still wanted to manage their trees and grow trees and do other things with them besides clear cutting them. So it worked pretty well. With 3 or 4 sawmills in the county, the forest industry was big during the 50s, 60s, and into the 70s. There was a lot going on. There was thinning and logging all over the county. The county got involved with lawmaking. San Mateo County, who also has a lot of timber that nobody realizes is there, already had a county ordinance. During the development of the state rules and licensing, the San Mateo rules really triggered a lot of that happening because they had rules, and somebody sued. A logger came in from someplace else and tried to log, and the county said, "Oh no, you've got to have a permit from the county." And so it came in, and that's when the lawsuits developed that set up the basis for setting the new forest practice rules. The sub-district practice rules in Santa Cruz, San Mateo counties, and Monterey counties are workable. You can grow trees there. You don't have to make a park out of it. Since then, a lot of land has gone into open space districts and parks. The available timber base is significantly reduced from going into zone for the proper zoning for a forest. If it wasn't zoned originally as forest land when the forest practice rules started, you can't log in the county anymore, in Santa Cruz County. San Mateo County still is usable. They're still flexible. So they've gone off the other direction a little too far, but it's a small county. It turned into be a good stretch there. I enjoyed being in Santa Cruz. We were involved a lot with the introduction of new forest practice rules statewide and local additions to those, the southern sub-district rules. San Mateo County had rules right along. And if you worked in San Mateo County, which was part of the watersheds we worked in, you had to address things to them before the forest practice rules were really put into force. So we were used to working with the government and working with landowners that cared about the forest. So we were doing a lot of things already. And a lot of the things that were incorporated into the southern district rules after the general forest practice rules, we were already doing. We were already lopping the slash. We were already only cutting a small percentage of the merchantable timber. We were already taking care of our roads and putting in the culverts and taking care of them. These are things that were easy for us, and we were able to implement indirectly a lot of the things that we were doing already into the southern subdistrict rules and some of them into the regular statewide rules. And it made it a lot easier because we were already lopping, we were already stopping our logging in November. We didn't log in the winter. We were making things function at a different level than had been done before. We tried to take the Forest Service rules, we watched them and they said, well, we're managing the forest for multiple purposes, and so we took the Forest Service rules and sort of added to them a little bit. In fact, we added to them a lot. Well, I've been involved with it from the extent of I've been out on locally on some field trips, and it's painful. It's painful for me to see good forest land go into any other use that eliminates that use of the forest. But most redwood ground is lousy grapeland. You need a little more heat. What we're finding, the impact of vineyard land is impacting timberland in areas that are suitable for growing grapes. Now here, we have vineyards that start right at the top of the first ridge above the ocean, which is about an elevation of maybe 1,000 feet, inland maybe a half a mile or mile from the ocean. And what's happening is they're pushing vineyards into that land and tapping into local streams for the water. It's impacted the value of the timberland, particularly in estates. A friend of mine has done some evaluations of estates. One right next door, where we're right on the top of the first ridge from the ocean. All of a sudden, it has potential to be vineyard land. And so all of a sudden, your vineyard land, instead of maybe being worth, let's just pull a number, instead of being worth $1,000 an acre, it's worth $5,000 an acre. Well, so all of a sudden, your inheritance thing gets all skewed. Because then you can't afford to grow trees on $5,000 acre land. It gets valued as timber, as potential vineyard land, and the estate taxes skyrocket, get way out of connection. And then what happens, it gets pushed in and valued as potential vineyard land, and you can't afford to grow trees on it. And that does impact local timberland, and it does right now. One very successful one that went in about 40 years ago now. It was Douglas fir land, farther inland. They clear cut it, and right after they clear cut it, a guy says, "Oh, great! I'm going to try growing grapes here." Well, now he's got prime grape land where you couldn't afford to grow trees on it. They make enough off of it in 1 year for grapes as it takes me 100 years to have on timberland. It's about 15 years ago, we actually built a house here in the woods. And it's a place where you look out at, and you can't see another house. I mean, there's just trees out there, and I really enjoy it. It's on a property called the Plantation Forest or Farm Camp. The location is an original stagecoach stop in the Sonoma County mountains on the coast. The location is relatively isolated. It was a ranch an early client of ours had. They purchased it to make a farm camp. They were city people and decided they wanted to have farm camp for kids to come out here and live on the farm, do farm chores and everything, and they developed a very successful farm camp. And as they were going along, they also wanted to manage their forest. And so they called us up, and the first time I worked on the property was in 1963, and I cruised the timber for them, and we looked at it and said, well, Abe and Eve, your forest really isn't ready. It had been logged in around 1880 with oxen and drug down to a mill in the canyon. It was logged again in the late 40s, 1940s, to a diameter cut of had a minimum cut of down to about 18 inches. But it wasn't ready yet in 1960 to start logging again. And they said, well, you keep track of it. And so during that time, I cruised the property. We made a management plan. And after the 10 years were up that we said it would take for the forest to be ready, almost to the day, Abe called up and said, we're ready to log. So I came up and we set up a timber sale. And since that time, we've been managing and logging this property annually ever since. It's been developed as a single tree selection managed forest where we cut a little bit of timber every year. We have found that after the first go around, it took us 3 cuts to cover the property because it was pretty spread out. We never cut more than we were growing each year. Our growth level is something like around 330 to 350,000 board feet a year. Our cut has been running around 200 to 225,000 a year. So we're actually growing more every year than we're ever cutting. So, and what surprising thing is it works. We did another cruise in, must have been in the late 80s. And we actually just finished a cruise this year to see if our numbers are still working. Well, the numbers are still being handled by my current forester, Matt Green, who actually worked for me for 15 years before he ever, or actually more like 12 years before he took over and started running the business. But he's worked on the property now, and he just cruised it again this year, and we don't have the numbers yet. But it looks like we're still doing all right with our sustained yield harvest and our growth rate. And the whole time, the property is still being used as a summer camp. We have an agreement with the now neighbors. The 30 acres of the property that was the main stagecoach stop was purchased by some ex-campers that went to the camp in the early days with the Crittendens. I didn't want to run a summer camp, so we split off the 30 acres of the stagecoach stop with the buildings and the barns and stuff, and we kept the 500 acres around it to manage as the forest. And they had some ex-campers come and buy the 30 acres and establish the summer camp again and continue it on. And since that time, there have been kids here every summer. It's maxed out now where they have a summer camp every summer. They have about 100 kids at a time for 2 to 4 week sessions. And it works great. We develop our cutting and our management of the property around the summer camp. We log in the fall. We do all our cleanup in the fall. We do extensive lopping and wildlife preservation. We protect the pastures. We lop the slash like we do on all our jobs. And we use the property every summer as a summer camp. We shut down the logging. We don't log in the spring. We log in the fall after camp so that the forest has a chance to heal and for the trees to fall down and limbs to fall so that the property is available for the kids. The 500 acres is available for the kids all summer. So it's a combination thing of we're managing a forest, but we're also managing a summer camp. And so we actually look at the property a little differently. And the kids appreciate it, and the counselors appreciate it, and it works out fine. And the family uses the property. My family does, and the Greig's family, and we use it primarily in the winter. We have friends that come up and stay, and we have a campsite, and they come up and stay in the camp, and they go down to the coast, which is just a couple miles away, and do abalone diving, and it's nice to have an abalone feed every time they go diving. My kids have their families now, and they have a family camp every spring where everybody within 200 miles shows up and camps out, and they get all their friends together for a week, usually in end of June. My sons both are Frisbee golf fanatics, and so they've set up a movable disc golf course. In fact, they've gotten a little lazier. We're sitting now in the middle of an area that's a pasture with some scattered trees in it, but for a week in the fall, they get together and all their disc golf buddies come up. They set up a course and have a tournament here every fall. And so we're right in the middle of the tournament area right here. And they come up and have a great party and a great time. And so the forest is really being used a lot. And besides being used a lot, I live in it. And I love living in the forest. I can't see another house. I'm able to go out and walk in the woods or drive in the woods, and I don't see any people. And it's just really a very, very pleasant place to live. It's a rural area. We have a school down the road that when we first started coming up here had 125 students in an elementary school. Well, with industry changing, the sawmill gone, population's changing, the population in the school now is 20. So our elementary school is down to 20 kids. But the area still has people that escaped from the Bay Area during the 60s. And a lot of the areas around here have been broken into 40s. The area just 2 miles down the ridge to the ocean along the coast is being populated by summer houses, some people living there. So what the school now on Sundays is our farmers market. Well, I kind of call it the Church of the Coffee, because I've been making coffee there for about 15 years, and we get together on Sunday morning and drink coffee and have a little farmer's market. It's really rinky-dink, but it's fun, and it's a meeting place for the neighbors. Because unless you have kids in the school or a volunteer fire department, you have no connection with your neighbors. So the Sunday market is kind of nice. So you get together on Sunday morning for a couple hours, drink coffee, sell eggs, garden vegetables, whatever, and so that's our meeting place. Gazos Creek Tree Farm is located in the Gazos Creek drainage right in San Mateo County. It's one of our very first clients. The owner was a professor at Stanford who had been teaching and professing, I guess one would say, writing papers and grants and stuff about conservation and forests. And he bought a 2,000 acre, heavily cut over piece of property in Gazos Creek in San Mateo County, because he wanted to show that he could do what he was talking about with conservation in the forest. Shortly after he bought it, he got a hold of us, and we hadn't really been working down there, but just peripheral out of Sacramento. And he was one of our very first clients in the Santa Cruz Mountains, and he wanted to do conservation. And we said, fine, well, let's go for it. And we had had enough background in selective cutting that we knew it could be done. And we went to work for him, and he was our first big client with 2,000 acres that we put under management and managed for 20 years. We planted, thinned, pruned, had annual harvests, very light selective harvest. And by the time we'd gone through 20 years, the property was in a heck of a lot better shape than when we started. It had roads with culverts in it. It had erosion control measures. It had planted trees. It had thinned trees. And it had a recreation area that in one portion they moved a summer camp in, where an old mill site had been 50 years before. There was an old mill pond, and they put in a summer camp, and a very successful summer camp. And at the same time, we were managing the forest, and we superimposed the professor's ideas onto our management and made it work. We found that you can grow trees and log at the same time. I mean, you don't have to clear cut, or you don't have to make a maximum cut. You can grow trees. And on that particular property, we found it really worked. And the volume and the growth, and when he got around to selling it, I hate to admit, he sold it to a guy from Oregon who thought, wow, I'm gonna come down and make a killing down here because there's all that timber out there. Well, he got down there, and we had local rules, and he couldn't clear cut it. He had to stick with our 60% cut was the maximum he could take out of any area. And he finally went bankrupt and sold it. So he couldn't handle it the same as he did in Oregon. So it was really great working with Dr. Hanna. And he really wanted to do it right. And we were able to interpret his wishes and put them into practice and carry it on and make it work. It meant selective cutting, lopping slash, leaving good trees and growing good trees, and having an ongoing forest that could be used for other things besides logs. And this was really a great thing. The only drawback was after 20 years, he decided he wanted to buy a chair at Stanford. And so he sold the property. And when that happened, I felt, after working on the property for 20 years, I felt just like I'd had a divorce. I mean, psychologically, it was a real blow. But you got to get over those kind of things too. So, things develop. And we were able to take what we developed over the first 20 years in Santa Cruz County and San Mateo counties into a real policy and working management plan that functions, that you're able to do everything. You're not locked into just doing one sort of thing. You're actually managing the forest for everything. The wildlife, the creeks, the water, and for recreation and for people to use. And you can make money. I mean, it all works together. And I think that's what's been so rewarding about this kind of management, because I'm still doing it now, except I just walk around the woods and tell somebody else what to do or kibitz of what they're doing. But we've been able to pass it on to a small group of foresters that have worked with us or imitated us and have spread the type of management in a good way, I think. There are a number of young foresters that are functioning this way. And it definitely influenced the southern subdistrict rules. Everywhere from limiting the logging in the winter to how heavy you can cut, to lopping the slash. These kind of things cost money, but it works. And that's the difference. That's the difference. You got to be willing to take a little bit less money every year, but in the long run, you actually make more, which was proved to me by a friend and forester in Santa Cruz that he was the forester for the sawmill down there, the Big Creek Lumber Company. And they were very early on started managing property in a good way. But his idea was cutting, using broad numbers and things. He liked to cut 60% of the merchantable stand. And that's what he based it. And his reentry was the same. His reentry period was every 10 years, where ours was cutting 30% of the merchantable timber every 10 years. Well, after he retired, he spent a lot of time on his computer and started playing with it. And he called me up and he said, "Ed, you're right. You actually made more money logging 30% every 10 years than I did, because you're growing bigger trees." And it turned out to be that it was that simple an answer, that in the long term, you have less disruption to the forest and you make more money. So that really made the whole thing feel good, that it actually worked. So I'm gonna jump back a little bit now and go back to, along with all this, I did have a family. And being in a Victorian house with a very artistic wife and two very active sons kept me busy. I found that I didn't have any hobbies. My work, my family, later my forestry business, that was my recreation. But I think the important thing to me was I was still working in the woods. I really enjoyed working in the woods, and I've always been a field forester. I don't do very well in the office, but I do well enough to survive. I've had some very good help and always a very good secretary to take care of office things. But I've enjoyed being in the forest. We've done a lot of different things. And once I was on my own, I had a concentration of landowners. I ended up not doing any real contract work after that. I had clients from the size of 15 acres to 9,000 acres. And they all required different attention. But I was able to use the same philosophy of forest management with the big ones and the little ones. And it worked. And that's the surprising thing, that we were looking at all the uses in the forest, not just the timber. And it all worked pretty good. Anyway, after 4 years of working with them, I got married and we settled in Santa Cruz. A couple of years later, we purchased a very old house. It was built in 1852 in Santa Cruz. We purchased it as an old house for sale on an R3 lot that would have capabilities of having 20 apartments. So that was the start. And of course, from there on, for the next 35 years, you rebuild Victorian houses. And thrown in on top of that was an earthquake in Santa Cruz, which helped us along to do a little more improving. But it turned to be a fantastic thing to have an old Victorian house. We had a big lot. We had 2 boys. It was a great place to raise kids. They had room. It was a central spot where the kids would come to play or visit. It was a meeting place because it was big. They had room. And we were right downtown. And it turned out to work very well. Later on, I actually had my office in the house because after about 24 years, Jim Greig and I split up the company, and he kept some clients that he wanted to work with and gave the rest to me. And so from there on, as a consulting forester, you're always working. Fortunately, my office for a long time was in the house, so at least I was home part of the time. I really enjoyed living in Santa Cruz. I mean, I lived right downtown. I was 2 blocks from City Hall. I had chickens in town. You're supposed to have only 5 animal units. Well, I had 5 chickens, but I also had a dog and a cat. Living downtown was a real interesting prospect because living in an old house, which is falling down, including an earthquake helping it a little bit, was an amazing thing. We were just 5 minutes walk from City Hall, right downtown. And to watch the town change from when I got there in 58, there were 15,000 people living in Santa Cruz at that time, and it was a retirement community and one of the last bastions of republicanism in the state. I mean, that was what it was, and it was a farm community and a recreation community that died after summer was over. So it was a small town of about 18,000 people. And watching the town grow and change was interesting, because with a county that was smaller than some large industrial ownerships was kind of interesting, because with only about a 240,000 acre county, the second smallest in the state, you had an entity there all by itself, thrown in just 20 minutes from San Jose now. Now the same town has 20,000 students at the university. And it's a different town. To see a town grow and change was interesting, because one is involved. You can't be uninvolved. My wife through this time was very, very involved with historic preservation. Was able to get historic preservation things passed to protect our old house that was falling apart when we bought it, to an area where you couldn't put in the 20 apartments, to an historic district. So it was interesting seeing how the town grew and changed. There was a sawmill and a tannery right downtown, right on the river. Now the tannery is gone, giant apartment buildings. The sawmill disappeared much earlier. But it was a small town, and to watch and see it grow. During the growth of that, the forest actually played a part in a lot of that. A couple of little mills came in. There's a mill now that went in on the coast, Big Creek Lumber Company. Could see that sustained yield management would work, and they're still in business. They're still in the county, and they purchased land and bought a lot of timber from us and our clients, and it really is part of the community. Neither of my sons wanted to be a consulting forester after being in. One of them went to work for the State Department of Forestry in the Santa Cruz area, and surprisingly enough, I turned around the other day and he said, "Well, I think I'm going to retire." And I said, "Well, you can't retire till I do." And so I decided at that point in my early 70s that I better retire, because I would really be embarrassed if my son retired before I did. And he enjoyed working with that. He worked with me a few years in the woods. When you work for the state in the early days, you worked for him just in the summer. So you had to have a winter job. So he worked with me and squeezed in his education in between. So it only took him 10 years to go to college. My other son followed his mother's guidelines and became an artist and got his degree in scientific illustration. And since then, he decided, well, he didn't like being cooped up all the time, and he went back to school and got his degree in teaching. So he became an art teacher, particularly in the elementary school level, and loves it. And he's still doing it, and he really enjoys that. But he still knows how to run a chainsaw and make firewood. So that's turned out great. The other thing, as things were going along, my wife was an artist, and she stopped working in a commercial firm. what would it be? You would call it a advertising firm. She stopped doing that and freelanced, and eventually became an independent freelance artist. And when she made that decision from doing commercial work to art, she said, "I'm never going to do another letterhead again in my life," and she didn't. Things went great. She died about 15 years ago, and at that time I was already living here on the forest, and so for that part of my career, for about another 5 or 7 years, I was single, living out here in the woods, and it's pretty quiet out here. And so 7 years ago I remarried and have a lovely wife and who's a great cook, and we live here in the forest and look out at the trees every morning, and it's great. Okay, we'll talk about the SAF and these sort of things. Yeah, I joined when I entered Berkeley. I think it's important to be involved with your profession, to have connections with your profession, not just somebody out there working. It's provided me with a lot as far as associated with people, getting together with meetings. The thing that I enjoy the most is the idea of, you've got field trips. You've got people out there showing what they can do, what you can and can't do, what this equipment will do, what that person can do, how we've manipulated this to do one thing. The field trips are the most important part to me. I get bogged down in scientific studies and research and stuff, but there's enough out there with your connections with that. And I was a member of the Association of Consulting Foresters, and they also have annual meetings and field trips and places where you can go see what people are doing. This is the important thing. Be able to exchange ideas, exchange looking, hands-on. I mean, enough of this. You can only get so much out of a mechanical subject, graphs, all that. You got to look at what can be done. And I think that's the important thing, a connection with the other professionals, getting out in the woods. If you like to work in the laboratory, seeing what happens in the laboratory, what's coming out. And I think that's the important part, and it's the association of being able to exchange ideas. And I'm a hands-on person. I want to go out there and I want to look at what you're doing in the woods. Is it working? Is it not working? And I think that's important. And I think that's the important part of the whole thing. And I think it's important that you're involved with your profession, that you just don't sit out there as an isolated person spouting off things. It's meant a lot to me. And I actually went up to Canada to one meeting not too many years ago, and I received an award for Field Forester for the Year. And that was really a good feeling, because it's your peers giving you some credit. And that was neat. And so I think it does carry on. There is feedback. There isn't a connection with everybody you run into, fine. But the meetings are beneficial to see what's happening from a technical standpoint, because you get out in the woods and you stay too isolated and you miss things. And so I don't do a lot of studies and stuff, but it gives you a chance. The SAF has people in all aspects, so you can see what's going on. I traveled in the South once by myself, and I stopped, and there was an SAF member working for a sawmill, a pulp mill. Hell, I'd never even seen a pulp mill. And he took me around. He spent all day showing me around what they were doing in the woods, how they were getting pulpwood out of the woods by hand. And I was going across town, and I said, well, do you ever get used to that smell? And he says, no, that smells like money. So, but anyway, and that was a connection through SAF. And I was traveling through the South, and I hit an SAF meeting, and they brought me in, and they just treated me just like I belonged there. I wasn't even a member of that group, or hadn't even signed. They incorporated me into their meeting, and I went on their field trip, and it worked. At the peak of everything going on, we had a SAF chapter set up in the community and had monthly meetings. At that time also, things were decreasing in the San Francisco area, and so we had people coming down from the peninsula and the East Bay to our forest meetings with the SAF. Now I think it's down to, there are maybe 3 foresters left in Santa Cruz, San Mateo counties, and 1 small sawmill. Interesting aspect on that. When I was in school, I wasn't eligible for the draft as long as I kept good grades. I was in school, and I got out of school kind of in between wars, and I'd been working about 2 years out in the woods, and I got called in for my draft physical. And I said, well, okay. And what had happened was, at one point I had dislocated a kneecap, jumped out and was in behind my knee instead of in front of it. And I said, I went in and I said, well, here I am. I've only been working 2 years. We're not in a war. They're fooling around over in Israel. I don't want to go into service. I don't feel any of it. So I said, well, okay. I had dislocated a knee, and the kneecap was over in the back. So that was fixed up, and I healed up, and it hadn't gone out. It's only gone out a couple times after that. And so I said, well, I really don't want to go into service. And so actually, I told him about my kneecap jumping out of place, and then I got 4F. So I didn't go in the service. No guilt, but I avoided, because I had just had 2 years in my career, and I knew I wouldn't have a job when I got back. Actually, I didn't have a mentor until I went to work for Jim Greig. And he was actually my mentor. And what it really turned out to be is we worked well together. And he had he played a dominant role. He had more experience than I did. And we worked together very well for 24 years. And beyond being a mentor, after 24 years, he said, here, you take this part of the business and carry on with it, and I'll take this part. And he kept 2 clients, went into semi-retirement, but that's not really retirement when you're a consultant. And then I started up from there. And so he was really my mentor. I mean, and he gave me the training I needed and the example of diplomacy. Diplomacy is worth a lot. In fact, in some ways it overbalances some academic things, because diplomacy gets things done. And diplomacy of learning to get along with people and getting along, particularly with clients. You have to be diplomatic or you're gone. And so that was a real important thing that I learned from him. And we remain friends and forever. In fact, we actually are equal partners in this forest that I'm living on right now. Yeah, I would talk to young people. In fact, people talk to me all the time about stuff. It's not very often a young person wants to know about working in the woods. There isn't much emphasis on that sort of thing anymore. I mean, there's tremendous conservation projects and attitudes about doing thing and going saving trees and stuff. Once in a while I'll talk to somebody that's interested in being a forester, and I'll be straight with them. It's really very difficult now being a forester. There are very few forestry jobs, number one, and I would really tell them that go try and work in it for a while. Go set some chokers for a while. No, they don't set chokers anymore, sorry. Go work in the woods for a while. Come out and be with me for a while. Go work with Matt Green out here and go and mark timber with him for some time. Then decide what you really want to do. It's not all sitting under a tree talking to the birds. There's a lot of hard work. It's challenging. It's a relatively low-paying job for a professional. And you gotta like doing it. If you don't like doing it and spending a lot of time on it, you better do something else. If you want to have your head in a computer, that's fine. If you want to sit in an office all the time, that's fine. But if you want to be a forester, you want to be out in the woods and getting dirty and being out there in the storm and the rain, digging out water bars and culverts. It's not as glamorous as it seems. You're not just out there talking to the trees all the time. I think the future for forest management on a small and broad scale in California, I think it's going to continue. I think it's going to take people with persistence, dedication, knowing what they're talking about, and going at it right, meaning take care of the forest. You don't have to put it in a reserve to have a good forest. You can have a managed forest. And it's going to take a person that's going to be willing to take the lumps and say, yeah, this is good management. I'm going to implement it. We're not going to just cut and run. We're in it for the long run. And if it doesn't happen, we're just going to keep diminishing the timber that's available to be managed. In this county, it's disappearing rapidly. We're losing thousands of acres that could be productive timberland used for all kinds of things, not just a park. And once it's into a park, it's pretty hard to change that description of how to use it. It's a strange thing, and I've lost clients' properties that have become open space, and open space says, well, oh, we're going to manage it. Well, they manage it for recreation and preservation. And so it's very difficult. And I think that it's going to be pushed further and further into the more rural areas of the state. And the rural areas are becoming fewer and farther between. When I started out, one could log in Marin County. Well, come on. You're not going to log in Marin County today. You can hardly walk through the woods in Marin County. I wouldn't be surprised to see it be outlawed in other counties. You can't make a law for it, but you can zone things so that you can't manage it for anything but to look at. And I think that's a mistake. It bothers me when I go to a friend's house in, say, a subdivision, and there's not a house in the whole subdivision that has any wood on it. They're all stucco houses. I mean, stucco houses, and they don't have shingle roofs. They have metal or concrete roofs, tile. You look around and the building is going. In some places, I was shocked a few years ago when in Santa Cruz, within 20 miles of a sawmill, they were building houses with steel studs. I mean, this changes the whole thing. I mean, we're going to have concrete houses, we're going to have steel 2x4s, metal roofs or concrete roofs. I mean, I think it's a renewable resource that we're really missing the boat if we stop using it and managing it. And I really feel strongly about that. I think we can have both. I think we can have good forests. We can have good forests to enjoy, healthy forests, productive forests that can produce a little bit of everything. Not everything for everything, but a little bit of logging, a little bit of recreation, a little bit of scenic value. All these things could be done in the forest, and it can be used for all those purposes, not just a single, let's look at it, use. I really like working in the woods. In fact, I go out now, and I can't work anymore. My body wore out. But I go out in the woods, I just walk in the woods, and I have a young forester doing my forestry work, and I go out and watch him, and I kibitz, and I give him some direction. I go out and I check the logging and watch it go on, see that it's done properly. I try and keep my mouth shut. But I still stay involved with it. I've also through the years I'm a certified arborist, which made it nice in town. When I lived in Santa Cruz, I would do arborist work in town because there were no people in town to do it at that time, and so I've enjoyed arborist work But I'll go out and I'm the neighborhood forester. And it used to be the state had foresters that called service foresters. That's what I am. And my neighbors have a question. They say, what about my tree? Or can I do something here? Or what should I do there? What should I do there? And I'll go talk to them and give them advice. There's two things I don't do. I don't write a report, and I don't charge them any money. And I really enjoy it. So I'm the service forester of the neighborhood. And it's fun.